بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So this book we're doing, Bidayatul Hidayah. I'd just like to quickly summarize what we've been through already, because there's a number of people who've just joined the class today. What Imam Ghazali is speaking about in here is about guidance, the beginning of guidance and the ending of guidance. The ending of guidance is reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, gaining paradise and reaching the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Imam Ghazali, he explains very clearly that the way to reach this guidance or have any right to this guidance is to get the beginning of guidance firm and solid. So the fundamentals of the beginning of guidance are very important. And that's what Imam Ghazali speaks about in this. He explains the beginning of guidance, the fundamentals of the beginning of guidance, and he explains how they are very important, and how if you are able to fulfill the beginning of guidance, the fundamentals of guidance, then you have a right to look at the end of guidance. Otherwise, it's all in vain. You have no right whatsoever. Then he explains that this beginning of guidance, a lot of it is to do with talabul ilm, and this talabul ilm is, the importance of the talabul ilm is that you must have the right intention. And then he mentions that there's three different types of people. The first is the person who is doing it for the absolute right reason, which is for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to gain an understanding of the deen and to go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and understand his deen and practice it, and then please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second one is the one who has got a bit of a mixed intention, who wants the world as well and a bit of the deen as well, and he knows that he's in a very, very sad situation, very bad situation, and he's trying to make it better for himself. So if he's able to make it better for himself before he dies, then he'll go into the first category. Otherwise, he's going to the third category, which is where a person is completely, where a person becomes completely worldly in a sense, or in another sense, his attention is completely for the world and not for the sake of the hereafter. And that's the worst of it. And that's the person who Imam Ghazali says that even if the teacher teaches that person, he's only helping him further into his sin, and so on and so forth. Then the way Imam Ghazali mentions this is that there's two things. The beginning of guidance is based on two things. One is obediences, and one is disobediences. And the way of the obedience is, he explains in this next chapter that we're about to begin, which is Al-Qism al-Awwalu fi at-Ta'at. That's where we are, part 1, on the acts of obedience. And this is actually the most interesting part of this book I found, which is the way he explains what to do from the beginning of the day to the end of the day in terms of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he explains how a person wakes up, how a person uses the bathroom, how a person goes to the toilet, uses, has a bath if he has to, and so on and so forth. And then how he goes to the masjid, and then how they spend the time between Fajr and sunrise, and so on and so forth. So we're about to begin, inshallah, Al-Qism al-Awwalu fi at-Ta'at. القسم الأول في الطاعات. اعلم أن أوامر الله تعالى فرائض ونوافل، فالفرض رأس المال وبه تحصل النجاة، والنفل هو الربح وبه الفوز بالدرجات. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم: قال الله عز وجل: ما تقرب إلي المتقربون بمثل أداء ما افترضته عليهم، ولا يزال العبد يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه، فإذا أحببته كنت سمعه الذي يسمع به، وبصره الذي يبصر به، ولسانه الذي ينطق به، ويده التي يبطش بها، ورجله التي يمشي بها. So he first explains that the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be categorized into two categories. The first are the fara'id, the necessary things, and the second are the nawafil, which are the supplementary, supererogatory actions. Now, in the Hanafi, you have to remember, Imam Shafi'i was from the Shafi'i school primarily, although he had certain opinions in which he was a kind of a mujtahid on his own because of his knowledge of fiqh. he explains that there's just two things, fara'id and nawafil, in the general picture of things. I want to just explain that from the Hanafi perspective, that in the Hanafis you have the fard and the wajib as well. Now the wajib is only considered wajib and a different category, even though according to Shafis and Malikis and others, wajib and fard are one and the same thing. The reason the Hanafis consider it something else is that what a wajib command is based upon, the dalil or the evidence is a bit weaker than that of the fard, and hence they've given it a separate category to show that the evidence and the source from which this is established and derived is not as strong, and hence the same kind of rulings cannot apply to it. But in terms of a person having to do a fard or a wajib, they have to do both things. They have to do both things, because the wajib is called fard amali, that it's a practical fard, that in terms of the human being, in terms of the person who is mukallaf and responsible, he has to fulfill that anyway. Then nafil will be everything else that's over and above the fara'id and wajibat. So these are just in general that he's giving this understanding. And so he says that فَالْفَرْضُ رَأْسُ الْمَالِ, that the fard is the fara'id, that is the capital of a person. That if he doesn't have a capital, how are you going to gain profits? Take it from an investment point of view. Take it from an investment point of view. If you don't have capital to invest, where are you going to make your profit from, unless you steal it, obviously? But there's no stealing rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that sense. So it's important that a person has capital, and the capital in our sharia is the fara'id. Once you fulfill the fara'id, then you can add on to it with the nawafil, and that's why you normally see that most of the prayers have some nafil prayers or some sunnah prayers associated with it. So let's put it this way. Let's say somebody is making tahajjud prayer, goes into the time of Fajr, makes the sunnah prayer and then goes to sleep, misses out the fard prayer, then he's really wasting a lot of his energy, because the fard prayer is actually more important than everything else. The sunnah prayers, and that will only gain their great significance is when they become supplementary to the fard and when they become added on to the fard. So that's why it's very important. That's why it's very important that we get the fard in, which is the ra'sul mal, or the capital by which we'll make our investment. وَبِهِ تَحْصُلُ النَّجَاةِ, and that is the way to gain salvation. That's what's important to gain salvation with as well. Otherwise, we will be sinful for missing those out. Although in the Hanafi school, the sunnah mu'akkada is actually more important than any of the other nafil prayers, in the sense that a person will be sinful for missing them out systematically. Once in a while, a sunnah prayer, if it's missed, there may be not an issue, but when it's missed out systematically, then there's going to be sin according in the Hanafi school. Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi wrote a whole book on this subject, in which he mentions the hukm of the fard of the sunnah prayer. Plus there's another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ which says that man lam yattabi' sunnati falam tanal shafa'ati yawm al-qiyamah, which is that a person who doesn't follow my sunnah will not gain my intercession on the Day of Judgment. So they are very important, but they still don't come into the category of fard. Then he says, وَالنَّفْلُ هُوَ الرِّبْحُ وَبِهِ الْفَوْزُ بِالدَّرَجَاتِ. So the nafl, that is the profit. That is the profit a person gains on their investment. وَبِهِ الْفَوْزُ بِالدَّرَجَاتِ, and that is the way a person is going to gain and win extra degrees in paradise, or higher degrees in paradise. So a person cannot gain those degrees unless he's got salvation in the first place. The salvation comes from the fard. That's why it's important to get the fard down first, then focus on the nafil, or do them both together. But not just on the nafil and missing out the fard. Then he explains this through a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which many of you must have heard already. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال الله عز وجل ما تقرب إلي المتقربون بمثل أداء ما افترضته عليهم. The Prophet ﷺ said, God most blessed and most high says, nothing brings men near to me like the performance of what I made obligatory for them, and through additional acts, optional worship. So nothing brings a person closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the performance of the fara'id, of the necessary thing. That's what gives you the initial closeness that a person requires to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. and through additional optional acts of worship. That's what comes second. My servant comes, then he says, and through additional acts or optional worships, my servant comes even nearer to me until I love him. And when I have bestowed my love on him, I become his hearing with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, his tongue with which he speaks, his hands with which he grasps, and his foot with which he walks. Now, this is actually a very important hadith, because a person who fulfills their fara'id and then has an intention to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the nawafil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take on full responsibility for that person. So He's going to become their hand by which they hold. Now, this is not to be taken in any kind of anthropomorphic idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes into the hand or something of that nature. It basically has been explained by the scholars as being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will guide the person's hand only to touch and hold things which are permissible and keep them away from anything wrong. Likewise, the feet from going towards any place that is haram or unlawful or not good or suboptimal to go to. And likewise, the eyes will not look at anything that's impermissible or unlawful, and likewise all of the other things that are the hearing, he won't listen to anything or she won't listen to anything that's unlawful or haram. So this is the way to gain a protection. Now, a lot of us, we fight. We always fight with ourselves, with our nafs, to try to do the right thing and to try to abstain from the wrong. Now, what's important is that if we focus our time on our fara'id and our nawafil, and we also try at the same time to stay away from sins, it's going to help us. If a person doesn't do the fara'id and doesn't do much nawafil, and then tries to abstain from sin, it's a good thing, but it's not going to help as much as if you also try to do the optional worships, because when you do the optional worships, that's how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us closer to Him, and then that's how much He controls us. And obviously, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is controlling our every move and our every statement and everything, then we will be much more. It'll be much easier for us to gain salvation and to stay away from sins. Then he mentions, وَلَنْ تَصِلَ أَيُّهَا الطَّالِبِ إِلَى الْمَقَامِ بِأَوَامِرِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى إِلَّا بِمُرَاقَبَةِ قَلْبِكَ وَجَوَارِحِكَ فِي لَحَظَاتِكَ وَأَنْفَاسِكَ مِنْ حِينِ تُمْسِي إِلَى حِينِ تُصْبِحِ. Imam Ghazali is just absolutely very intricate, very elaborate when it comes to these things. And he explains the stage of everything. So he says, now that I've told you that you need to do the fara'id and the nawafil to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how do you get to that state? How are you going to be able to even fulfill the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You're only going to be able to do that if you are remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every state of yours. So he says that you will never arrive at fulfilling the commands of Allah the Exalted, O my dear student, unless you watch over your heart and your limbs at every single moment from morning to night. So that's the important thing, is to look after oneself. Then he says, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى مُطَّلِعٌ عَلَى ضَمِيرِكَ وَمُشْرِفٌ عَلَى ظَاهِرِكَ وَبَاطِنِكَ وَمُحِيطٌ بِجَمِيعِ خَطَرَاتِكَ وَلَحَظَاتِكَ وَخَطَوَاتِكَ وَسَائِرِ سَكَنَاتِكَ وَحَرَكَاتِكَ وَأَنَّكَ فِي مُخَالَطَتِكَ وَخَلَوَاتِكَ مُتَرَدِّدٌ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ. He says, God Most High, know that Allah Most High is aware of your intentions. He observes your inner and your outer being. He comprehends your every glance, your every thought, your every step, and whatever else you do, moving or resting. Now this is actually where we really understand the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That just imagine that when we are trying to observe one person or speak to one person, we become distracted if another person speaks while we're having that meeting. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at any single moment or at every single moment is hearing everything that is being said in the entire universe. And He's hearing all of this simultaneously, He's hearing all of this, He's understanding all of this, and He's responding, in a sense, to all of this as well. He's not just hearing everything, he's seeing everything that takes place, whether it's visible to anybody else or not, whether it's done in the deepest recess of any place. So know and understand that you are not veiled by others, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a direct link to every single human being, and that He's able to see and hear and know about everything that's going on, not just externally, but internally as well, in terms of every thought. So your every step and whatever else you do, whether it's moving or resting, meaning whether you're in motion or whether you're just sitting still, in your company and in solitude, you live constantly in His presence. فَلَا يَسْكُنُ فِي الْمُلْكِ وَالْمَلَكُوتِ سَاكِنٌ وَلَا يَتَحَرَّكُ مُتَحَرِّكٌ إِلَّا وَجَبَّارُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ مُطَّلِعٌ عَلَيْهِ. Throughout the world of mulk. So he talks about two things, the mulk and the malakut. The mulk is the worldly realm of existence, which is the existence that we can see. And the malakut is the unseen realm of reality, which is all the eschatological realities and everything else that we cannot see, and that we have not yet reached, maybe the hereafter, the dimension of our life or of anybody's life before they actually come into this being. You know, the alamul arwah, the universe of the souls, and so on and so forth, that which is not apparent to us. Throughout the world of mulk, which is the worldly realm of existence, and the world of the malakut, which is the unseen realm of reality, there is no rest of a resting thing, nor a motion of a moving object, unless the compeller of the heaven and earth is aware of it. So it doesn't matter whether it's in this world or in the other world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows about it. So then Imam Ghazali says, فَتَأَدَّبْ أَيُّهَا الْمِسْكِينُ ظَاهِرًا وَبَاطِنًا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى تَأَدُّبَ الْعَبْدِ الذَّلِيلِ الْمُذْنِبِ فِي حَضْرَةِ الْجَبَّارِ الْقَهَّارِ واجتهد ألا يراك مولاك حيث نهاك ألا يراك مولاك حيث نهاك ولا يفقدك حيث أمرك. He knows the treachery of the eyes and that which is concealed in the breast. He knows the secret and what is still more hidden. This is actually from another nuskha. He's got it in the translation. It's actually from another edition. But this is what we read in this edition. So, O you humble man. Yeah, actually it's in another edition, which is that يُؤَكِّدُ ذَلِكَ قَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى يَعْلَمُ السِّرَّ وَأَخْفَى. He knows the treachery of the eyes and what is concealed in the breasts. This is in the Quran. And also He knows the secret and what is still more hidden. So, O you humble man, and obviously woman as well, but because he's talking to a student of his that is said he wrote this as a letter to, he is using the masculine sense. But inshallah, wherever he talks just about something to do with men, I'll try to bring in the women aspect. For example, when he talks about using the bathroom, doing ghusl and other things, and on the other rulings of prayer and so on, he normally talks about it from a male perspective because he's speaking to a man. But I'll try to mention at least the Hanafi understanding of how the women's prayer is and so on when that part comes to it. And if I know the other madhabs, I'll mention that as well. Or some of you can point it out if you're from another madhab. So, O you humble man, act mannerly, both inward and outward, in the presence of Allah. This is talking about adab. Adab, we have adab for others. In this country, especially when you go to the supermarket or whatever, there's a lot of adab that we use or so-called apparent adab that we use where we say, good morning and have a nice day and so on and so forth. And if you just go around in silence, normally, people consider you to be rude or offensive. Now the thing is, it's important that this adab just not be for others, and especially for those who we may be benefiting from only. It's actually for everybody and for everything, and likewise, especially from Allah, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He says, تَأَدَّبْ أَيُّهَا الْمِسْكِينَ. O you humble man, act mannerly, both inwardly and outwardly, in the presence of Allah Most High, as a lowly and erring servant, in the presence of the powerful and victorious King. That's how we must make ourselves, that look, we're sinners, or we have the potential of sin, and we could drop into sin any time, and that we are very low, we are purely a slave, we are slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if we act like that, in that humbleness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's much more that we are to gain in that regard. Let your endeavor be that your master may not see you where he forbade you to be, and may not miss you where he commanded you to be. These are two very short sentences, but we should keep them at heart all the time, which is that try your utmost, wajtahid, try your best, that your Mawla, your Lord, does not see you from where He's prohibited you. وَلَا يَفْقِدَكَ, and He should not miss you or find you absent from that place that He's told you to be. So when it's prayer time, when it's time to be in a certain place to help somebody else or whatever, make sure that you are there. Make sure that He's not missing you at that time. And likewise, be where He has tried to make sure that He doesn't see you where He's prohibited you from. Then Imam Ghazali again comes to that practical level again and says that how do you gain all of this? How are you able to observe obedience in everything and make sure that you do muraqabah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have adab for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you make sure that He doesn't see you where He's prohibited you, and you do what He is, and He finds you not absent from where He's commanded you to be. So how are you able to do this? And this comes all the way from the barakah of time, which a lot of us suffer with, which a lot of us are dealing with. So he says, وَلَن تَقْدِرَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ إِلَّا بأن توزع أوقاتك وترتب أورادك من صباحك إلى مسائك فأصغي إلى ما يلقى إليك من أوامر الله تعالى عليك من حين تستيقظ من منامك إلى وقت رجوعك إلى مضجعك. You will not manage to do this, i.e. act of obeying Allah, however, unless you plan out your time. So he gives the secret of barakah in time, which we've been looking for a long time, is you're not going to manage any of this unless you plan your time out and order your activities from morning to evening, from the moment you wake up from sleep until the time when you return to your bed. Be diligent in performing the commands of Allah Most High upon yourself. Now, just to give you some personal experience, when I first came into this country about 6 years ago, after having studied in India, in Syria, and South Africa, and in England, I found that there was much less barakah in this country, personally, and that's what I found. Even though I had more time to myself, I wasn't necessarily going to classes or anything of that nature. I just found that the day would just fly by. I wouldn't be able to accomplish much. There's a lot of writing work I was able to do while studying, and for the exams, and studying in madrasa, taking so many classes, studying Bukhari, Muslim, etc., etc. And yet at the same time I was able to write more, I was able to publish more, I was able to do a lot of other things, whereas when I came here it took me 3 years to publish another edition of one of the books that we published before. Whereas in madrasa we published 3 books in 2 years in no problem whatsoever, despite all of the other occupation that we had. So when I came, I talked to some of my teachers, and there were different responses that I got. One of them, which was actually very useful, is that one of the teachers said, do dhikr, remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the time is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you spend time remembering Him, where you actually dedicate times of the day where you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you do your tasbeehs, you do your awrad, you read from Al-Hizb Al-Azam, you read from the Istighfar book, whatever it is. When you spend time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He'll actually open up the rest of the time, so you'll accomplish much more. But if you're always just trying to get in a lot of worldly activity and worldly accomplishment stuffed into your day, and you don't leave any time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except basically for the fara'id or whatever, then you are going to be left to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're going to be left to yourself, and you won't get the barakah. You're going to be left to your limited human capacity. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important that you open up yourself for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why it's important that, for example, let's try, when we read this, then especially the next portion, to try to act on it and see if we can include that in our daily schedule. Basically, the secret to it is to spend your time in a very, very appointed way, where you organize your day properly. So obviously some of us have to work, some of us have to study, we go and do that, but there's other times where we are spending purely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we make sure we do that. The secret is to stick to your routine. For example, if your routine is that if you get up in the morning, you are going to first do your tilawah of the Quran, whether it's half a juz or 1 juz or 1.5 juz, right? Or this many pages, and I'm going to do this many istighfar. For example, let's say you're going to do 10 istighfar from the istighfar book, or you're going to do 100 istighfar for yourself. Then you're going to, for example, you're going to do tilawah of the Quran and do some other dhikr of Allah. You're going to do some muraqabah, and you're going to spend, let's say, 45 minutes or 1 hour. Make sure you do that before you get in front of everything else. It's so easy that once you get in front of the computer to just check your email, you're going to get stuck in it for the rest of the day. So it's very important that you first, before you even switch the computer on, if that's what your occupation is, right? Before you go where you have to go, before you're doing what your normal daily occupation is, do your dhikr first, and do not move from that place until you actually do it. And that's some of the ways to make sure that you can get a routine of adhkar and awrad, which is very important, because the barakah of that is great. You'll see that there's barakah of that for the rest of your day. There's barakah in the work that you do, inshallah. There's barakah in the studies that you will do, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be helping you out. You'll be that much closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from tomorrow, he starts at faslun fi adab al-istiqadhi min an-nawm. So he's going to literally go through the whole day, through every single prayer and through what you do between the prayer times, what's the best thing to do, the du'as to read, and inshallah, that's what we begin tomorrow. So if anybody has any questions, we have some time, inshallah. Yeah, the barakah of time, that's actually very important, because otherwise your day just goes by and you just feel like you haven't accomplished everything. You get frustrated, especially if you're a person who wants to accomplish a lot in deen. So it's actually very important to do that. Actually, once I remember, there was a student, and in the madrasa, many of the students would actually go, because they were linked to the shaykh, they would actually go for the dhikr majlis. And this person was more studious than anything else, this one particular individual, and he would spend more time to basically study their books, and especially during exam times, be after his books to make sure that he's studying well. But once he was feeling that, let me go and check this dhikr majlis out, so he went into the dhikr majlis and he just stayed there for half an hour. And then he liked it, so he went there the next day as well, and he noticed that he was now getting way more accomplished in terms of his review and so on than he was before he was spending that half an hour. Initially, for so many years, he thought that even spending that half an hour going into that dhikr majlis is actually going to take time away from his studies. I mean, he didn't play sports or anything. He was just focused on their study. But the time that was spent in the dhikr gathering really benefited him, because he gave him a lot of barakah in the rest of the time that he spent. So he was able to accomplish and understand way more and comprehend way more than he was before. Can you sort of say that the fard is somewhat useless without nawafil, sort of like a math exam, you're obliged to give the papers, but you do it properly, that's when? No, absolutely not. I mean, that's actually not the right way to look at it at all. Because the fard is going to give you salvation at least. It may not give you a high... I mean, if you don't do the extra nawafil and the extra sunnahs that are related... For example, let's say you're making your salat. And in your salat, you're not really being relaxed about it, you're not fulfilling all of the sunnahs of the prayer, you're still going to be absolved of your obligation, inshallah, right? But you're not going to get any higher status, you're not going to get the bonuses. Some of the ulama have explained this, that every single worship, basically like bonus points, every single worship that we are to do, it's explained, the angels basically have a list of how much is the base reward for each worship, like for salat, and for maybe giving sadaqah, maybe giving zakat, except fasting. Fasting, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنَّ الصَّوْمَ لِي وَأَنَا أَجْزِي بِهِ, that the fasting is for me and I'm going to be directly in charge of giving rewards for that. But everything else, it says, some scholars have related, has a base degree of rewards that a person gets. And then for the sincerity of that person, for how the person entreats Allah, for how the person pays attention to that worship, and so on and so forth, all of that then adds up as a bonus. So let's say you're going to the masjid for prayer. There's going to be one reward for that. But if you've had to spend a lot of gas money to do that because you had to drive further, the gas is more expensive, the petrol actually, which is the right word, that is going to give you more reward because of that spending. So it's very important that you understand that the fara'id, they're going to give us the basic salvation, which is very important. And it's difficult to do many fara'id without some nawafil. So what we're talking about here is like a lot more extra nawafil to get even closer to Allah. So it's absolutely wrong to say that that it's worthless without nafil. No. But the nafil just gives it way more worth. Can we say that the likes of Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anhu, Imam Abu Hanifa and others were able to read the entire Quran in one rak'ah because of the barakah in their time? I'm sure if the average Muslim tries to do this, it would probably take them over 24 hours to do this. No, I mean, yes, of course, you can say that they had more barakah in their time, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would let them do that. For example, it talks about how Dawood alayhi salam used to be able to read his entire Torah while just having his horses girdled. So there's definitely an element of barakah, no doubt. But you have to also remember, they know the Quran so well, so they can concentrate and read probably faster and concentrate on it. I mean, a normal hafiz who knows this stuff well can probably do 3 juz at a decent pace. He can do 3 juz an hour. So you're talking about 10 hours, they could probably do the whole Quran. Some people can actually read much faster if they really know it well, but then they're going to be like at the edge of missing out on the tajweed and the makharij and so on. So they can do 4 juz an hour, 15 minutes an hour. I've seen that happen as well. 15 minutes for a juz. So you're talking about 4 juz in an hour. So that's 30 divided by 4. That's in less than 10 hours. Right? That's in less than 10 hours. But then when you talk about these scholars who are able to do like this many Qurans a day, then you're really talking about a lot of barakah. And there's no doubt about that. They're able to accomplish way more. So that's actually a very good point that you brought up. I understand that additional worship and the supererogatory prayers will benefit one in getting closer to Allah, but sheikhs often say that if you aren't putting concentration or your heart into the prayers, it's better to do less than more. What would you say about this? It's actually, that's obvious. When Imam Ghazali talks about the fara'id, he's talking about a fard that incorporates at least a basic amount of concentration. Right? That's understood. He's got that first initial concentration amount, because if you've got absolutely no concentration, your salat is going to be thrown back to you. So yes, that's a good idea to work on concentration first and to do more. Now the thing is, the way to work on concentration is to do more of it and try to be more concentrating. Right? You can't say, I'm only going to try 4 rakats. You see, if you're weightlifting for, you have more sessions in weightlifting, you're going to get better than if you just did a certain amount of weights a day and say, I'm only going to do more when I actually get better. Whereas in salat, what it is that if you try to do more and you try to concentrate in each one of them, you've got more of a chance of gaining that concentration because you've got more practice. You mentioned about praying sunnah prayers every time in Hanafi madhab. What if you live in an area where your family is not Muslim and they don't encourage you to do good? You live far from the masjid and your upbringing was that of a non-Muslim convert, and when you pray your heart is weary from lack of spiritual fruits. How does one encourage oneself to do sunnah prayers, since lack of spirituality in one's heart barely does, spirituality, because of lack of spirituality, one's heart barely does fard prayer and some dhikr and recitation. I'm worried because of the hadith where Prophet ﷺ says you cannot overcome religion. I even seen people lose faith from trying to overexert themselves in an environment I have. Look, what we're talking about here is in a conducive environment, and that a person can try to make that. Now obviously if somebody has an exceptional situation, then no doubt they have to adjust to that situation. They have to work on trying to make it better for themselves, and keep praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah make that their circumstance conducive for getting better for Islam. What Imam Ghazali is speaking about here is the best of approaches. It's the highest position. Now obviously if somebody is not in a position to gain that, then they must seek it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as you said, not overburden themselves. If a person feels that if I do too much of this, I'm going to become overburdened, I'm going to absolutely just leave it, then they should stick to the minimum, which is the fara'id. So every person has a different situation because they're dealing with different mentalities, the different people around them, their personal state of things, the exposure they have to other people, especially pious people. So all of that actually plays into role. But I believe that if you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala well enough, and when He thinks the time is right for you, as long as you keep asking Him, never lose your hope in that, He's going to make it easier for you. He's going to make your situation way better for you. Plus all of the good deeds that you are trying to do in a situation which is not conducive, which is not advantageous to you, there's a lot more reward. Aisha radiallahu anha relates a hadith which is in Sahih al-Bukhari, which mentions that your rewards are based on the hardship that you undertake. So if a person is going way further for Fajr or praying Salat in a place where people don't like him to pray, and he's still doing it because they're in school or they're at work and they're finding an empty office or an empty lecture hall or whatever, and they're going to pray, there's going to be a lot more reward for that person. Let's put it this way, there's going to be an extra reward for that person for undergoing that hardship. So never will your work be in vain, but do not overburden yourself. Come on to it gradually. That's also important.